Welcome to my studying, fellow fans of the written word. Here I am finally with a review of The Eye of the World. Yes, I'm finally done. Let's give things a bit of a context here. As you know, I went into this book completely blind. I already outed myself as a complete Wheel of Time noob. That's right. I claim to be a fantasy fan without reading Robert Jordan's seminal work within the genre and just, the fantasy canon at large. So a little background. Growing up, I lived in a small Croatian town. We had a public library, which is pretty good. It was great, actually. It was my favorite place probably to be. But my choice at reading fantasy and just genre fiction in general was limited by the whims of publishers. They decided what goes to the shelves. Selection was very particular. No matter how much something of a classic is, even at that time, like 10-15 years ago, a small market such as the Croatian one limited them in what they could buy. Which is why I read a lot of Ted Williams, I read a lot of C.S. Lewis, I read a lot of YA, the good kind and the bad kind, the copycats that kind of came in the first wave in the early 2000s after Harry Potter hit, and of course Tolkien. And looking back, I appreciate it because at the time it didn't seem so. At the time I was kind of resentful that, I hear about these great works of literature on the internet and from some of my other friends, but why is no one buying them? Why is my library not giving them out? But honestly, one net positive with this whole thing was just how unburdened I was with the fact that this was published 30-50 years later. Will it read dated? Will it be uncool? No. For example, Memory, Sorrow and Thorn trilogy by Ted Williams. When I read it, I had zero context. I did not check publishing date if it's an older work of fantasy. When I read it, it read surprisingly fresh. And I reread it 3 or 4 years ago, long after I stopped reading YA, and I still think that it is one of the best YA entry-level fantasy you can hope for even today. I highly recommend it. But alas, as the books I talked about, they survived the ages. They were new to me because I read them for the first time in the library. But Wheel of Time was never translated. I don't think it's still translated to this day. I think there's a Serbian edition. But after I moved past the whole thing, I eventually made a jump to ebooks. I started reading ebooks on my phone, then I bought a Kindle, and almost exclusively I started reading in English, occasionally in Russian and in Croatian. As my reading habits widened, it was a good thing, of course, but a downside to this was I was pursuing newer contemporary works. But 2 weeks ago, I finally made a jump to remove this blind spot of mine and start my journey through Wheel of Time. I have documented my reactions and expectations with previous videos, but now I just like to review this book as a singular piece of fiction. First things first, what I expected. I expected a predictable but a fun romp with a small cast. A setup for the series, possibly some sexism involved from the comments that I've read from other people. Annoying character, maybe. A subset of fans seems to really dislike Nynaeve. I loved her. And the soft type of magic system that doesn't stray too far from its primary influence, the Fellowship of the Ring, the first book in the Lord of the Rings series. What I got was, it was clearly a work that was inspired by the Fellowship, but not as egregiously as some of its contemporaries, like Shannara or even Riftwar. I think they were much more shameless and direct in their influences. Some things were clear stand-ins. Fate is Nazgul, or not Nazgul as I called it. We have, of course, the stereotypical journey from an idyllic village, splitting the party. We have a character named Matt, who is clearly a Pippin ex-spy, and the name Perrin is very suspiciously close to Peregrine Took. But what I did not get was a plot-driven book, which was I initially expected. I think it was more of a character piece. Plot was the framing for this character piece, of course, but I saw it as what happens when a person who lives a comfortable, if not opulent life, a farm boy, and then you have this wizard, sorcerer figure barging into their town and asking, and not even asking, saying, you need to go with me, we are going to save the world. In most of the stories, it would go like, yeah, sure, let's go, I'm going on an adventure. But here it was a bit more realistic. It was, no thanks, how about no? I'm pretty good, thank you. Again, a reluctant hero is nothing new, but it was something refreshing, because where Tolkien wrote these elevated figures of myth, now Jordan, he writes people, flawed people, and that was to his benefit. I also got a much larger cast, with not one but 3 potential chosen ones. Each of them had distinct quirks, fears, character traits, and an attitude. Oh yes. Matt is probably my least favorite. I think that I very much hate him in real life. Maybe hate is too heavy of a word, but I don't think we'd get along. But I can tell what kind of person he is. In my mind, he is a troublemaker, but I don't think he's a troublemaker with malicious intent. Maybe too selfish and self-absorbed for my taste. Then we have Perrin. Perrin is this stoic, introspective character. He is always concerned with how his actions impact others. He's probably my favorite of the bunch. Then we have Rand. Rand is a stubborn but very determined person. He is at the same time deeply insecure but also strong-willed. Nynaeve is second favorite, which I did not expect. I expected someone very aggressive, forceful. Turns out she cares a lot. It's hard to take that as a negative. She's also a fantastic source of comedy. She wears her heart on her sleeve, and just reading the passages where she's absolutely fuming from the serenity of Moraine despite her attempts to bait her made me laugh every time. Also, we have Egwene. Now, Egwene wasn't as defined as I thought she'd be, but she's someone who lived for an adventure before she set out to have an adventure, and she eventually found this adventure, but she did not lose herself. She did not give in, so to say. Then we have Len and Moraine, which were not as fleshed out, but I don't think they needed to be. They were more of a mentor figures in this book, and I think they worked well for that purpose. And of course we have Loial, who is a sort of a secondary character, but I want to protect him at all costs. He's the real MVP as far as I'm concerned. He's the best. What I didn't care for. I did not care for one very specific thing, and please don't crucify me for this, fellow Wheel of Time fans, because I do consider myself a fan at this point. But Robert Jordan's attempt at conlanging did not impress me. Now, what is a conlang? It is a short term for constructed language. It is a fictional language made up for the purpose of a book, TV show, whatever, like Dothraki. It's a fictional conlang. It's a conlang. It's a made-up language. It's usually something that authors use for fantasy races. Tolkien was the best at this. And Robert Jordan's attempt at conlanging did not impress me. Honestly, it was a bit grating when characters spoke in a fictional language, especially at the latter half of the book. It felt off. It didn't feel good. It did not feel that it had flow. I have no idea if Robert Jordan set out to make a whole language, which is a huge undertaking. I'm not saying that you can just sit down and construct a language. Absolutely not. I just think that this did not feel like it had structure. But thankfully it wasn't that present through the book. It didn't dominate anything, so not a huge minus. But it was still memorable enough for a wrong reason. But I want to add something to this. I like his naming conventions. I like names of places. I like titles. I like names like Daishen, Aes Sedai, Talviren. I like those. And I did not like Matt's character. Again, I don't need a character to be sympathetic to appreciate how they were written. I feel that a lot of his behavior was a bit off. Being aloof and mischievous was one thing, but actively putting your friends in danger several times in a row is different. And after he was freed from this evil influence, his first attempt at an apology was to deflect blame from himself. Classy. I also wish Egwene had more to do, because this was her story as well, but maybe this will change in the sequels. Also, some of the pacing felt too slow, too deliberate during the chapters where Rand and Matt were on a boat. A lot of it was just, no pun intended, wheel turning, but thankfully it was pretty brief. And a bit of a nitpick, and a viewer did point out to me that this was absolutely intentional by Robert Jordan and that there will be a payoff, but I do not like being beaten to the head with something by the author, namely Rand's apparent outsider status. His eyes, his height, his foreign mother. These three things alone, even the color of his eyes alone, should be enough for us to get the point across that Rand is an outsider. But then we have this, plus there was a very clunky scene at the beginning of Rand's father spouting just exposition while being feverish and talking about how he is not who he is. That was just a bit too much. What I loved emphasis on character development and their feelings. I'm increasingly choosing my fiction, and characters matter to me more than pretty much any setting or magic system ever will. I commend Jordan on this. I care about these people and what happens to them. The larger cosmology, the titular wheel, and the society that was portrayed. This is also a huge plus. I appreciated the picture Jordan managed to paint. Small village communities, their dynamics. Then we have larger cities and their dynamics, each with unique flavor and very believable circumstances. Also, the threats and perils felt real, and the victories, especially small victories, felt earned. Even though the fate of the world is at stake, la-di-da, page-to-page scale was contained and restrained. It still felt close to the characters. It also stuck the landing. This is a first in the series, but it had a very satisfactory finale. Despite some of my cons I presented here, the word dated never really crossed my mind when I was reading this. There is a certain timeless quality to Robert Jordan's writing, and I consider this to be a huge positive. Very little of it felt poorly worded, poorly thought out, or just grating. Or sexist. I did not get this impression. It also made me invested. Usually when I read something, even if it is a first in a series, I read a palette cleanser. If I'm reading a fantasy novel, next thing I'll read will be a biography or a science fiction novel, something completely different, and then I'll get back to the series. Here I am starting the next book, The Great Hunt, as soon as I'm done with this. So, thank you for watching, and see you next time.